How does someone stand up and do the right thing when they know that they're going to face great opposition?
You have to.
The Daystar network has been rocked by an explosive revelation as Rebecca opens up about the tension behind closed doors. In an emotional tell-all, she exposes the truth about the ongoing rift between Joni and Doug, shaking the very foundation of the Daystar family. Fans are stunned, and whispers of betrayal and deep-seated conflict are swirling. What really happened? Get ready for an inside look at the drama that has finally come to light. You won't believe what Rebecca has to say. The story of Rebecca Lamb and her husband JW is one marked by silence, secrecy, and immense pressure. For years, they were caught in a situation that many could never fully understand. The couple had been living with the weight of a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, that had been allegedly enforced by Rebecca's mother Joni Lamb and the Daystar television network. This NDA wasn't just a legal document, it was a barrier that kept Rebecca and JW from speaking out about one of the most painful and disturbing issues they had ever faced. The NDA, according to reports, was so sweeping that it covered more than just the typical business matters. It extended to personal family issues and sensitive internal network concerns. It prevented them from discussing the allegations of sexual abuse involving their niece Baby Lamb, which had been allegedly perpetrated by a family member named Pete. The fact that the NDA also covered this specific issue left Rebecca and JW feeling trapped. They had witnessed disturbing behavior from Pete, including inappropriate physical interactions with Baby Lamb, and yet they were unable to speak about it due to the looming legal document. This NDA placed a heavy burden on the couple, not just professionally, but personally. While they watched as their family suffered, including the emotional turmoil that Jonathan and Susie Lamb went through in trying to protect Baby Lamb, Rebecca and JW were silenced. They were caught between loyalty to their family and the harsh reality of legal restrictions that kept them from doing what they knew was right. Behind the scenes, the pressure wasn't just legal. Reports suggest that Rebecca's own sister, Rachel Lamb, warned her that speaking out could result in them losing their home. This threat added an extra layer of stress and fear, making it even more difficult for Rebecca and JW to make the decision to break their silence. They were not just fighting for what was right, they were fighting for their family, their financial security, and their reputations. But the silence wasn't just a matter of protecting the family business. It was a matter of morality. Every day, Rebecca and JW had to live with the knowledge that they knew the truth, but were unable to speak it. It weighed heavily on their hearts, knowing that the truth about what happened to Baby Lamb had to be kept hidden, all in the name of protecting the public image of the Lamb family and Daystar. This was a devastating position for them, one that placed their faith, their integrity, and their personal well-being on the line. It wasn't until the passage of Trey's Law, a legislative act that makes NDAs unenforceable in cases involving child abuse, that Rebecca and JW were finally freed from this oppressive silence. With the new law in place, the NDA could no longer prevent them from speaking out about what they had witnessed, what they knew, and what they hoped would finally come to light. The silence had lasted for years, but now, with the legal freedom to speak the truth, Rebecca and JW were finally able to begin the journey of revealing the ugly truths that had been hidden for so long. Trey's Law represents a monumental shift in how child abuse cases are handled, particularly those involving non-disclosure agreements, NDAs. This law, which was recently passed in Texas, makes it clear that no longer can NDAs be used to silence victims of abuse or those who are trying to expose the truth. For years, NDAs were a powerful tool used by organizations, families, and even businesses to prevent damaging information from becoming public. These agreements were often used to keep the peace or maintain a public image, but in many cases they were used to hide the truth of child abuse and protect those who had committed heinous acts. The law was named after Trey, a young boy whose case became a rallying point for the legislation. Trey was a victim of sexual abuse, and his case highlighted the misuse of NDAs to cover up the abuse and prevent justice from being served. Trey's Law is significant not only because it addresses this specific issue, but also because it marks a turning point in how society deals with the silencing of victims. No longer will families and organizations be able to use legal contracts to prevent victims from speaking out about the pain they've experienced. It was a step forward for justice and transparency, allowing victims to reclaim their voices and seek the help they deserve. The impact of this law extends far beyond Trey's case. it has a ripple effect on countless others who have been silenced by the weight of NDAs in situations involving abuse, particularly when it involves minors. These legal agreements have been used to stop victims from speaking about their experiences and prevent families from seeking justice. But with Trey's Law, there's now a legal avenue for these voices to be heard, and it creates a precedent for how these cases should be handled in the future. For Rebecca Lamb and her husband JW, Trey's Law was a lifeline. For years, they had been unable to speak out about the disturbing events they had witnessed regarding baby Lamb's abuse. They were bound by an NDA, a legal contract that made it nearly impossible for them to publicly address what was happening within their family. The NDA not only protected the abuser, but also kept the victims in silence. It was a constant reminder of the powerlessness they felt in a situation that was already fraught with pain. The emotional toll was immense as they watched their family struggle with the abuse, knowing they could not speak up for fear of losing everything. When Trey's Law was passed, it was as if a weight had been lifted off Rebecca and JW's shoulders. The law made it clear that NDAs could no longer be used to suppress the truth in cases of child abuse. This provided them with the legal freedom to speak out without fear of retribution or legal consequences. It gave them the power to finally tell their story, to share what they knew, and to help bring the truth to light in a way that could lead to justice for baby Lamb. The law also sent a strong message to organizations and families that have been using NDAs to protect themselves instead of their victims. It highlighted that the well-being and safety of children should always come first, and that any attempt to cover up abuse or silence the truth is no longer acceptable. Trey's Law not only impacted Rebecca and JW's situation, but also paved the way for other victims of abuse to come forward without fear of legal retaliation. It has empowered many who have been living in silence for far too long, giving them the strength to speak their truth. One of the key aspects of Trey's Law is that it specifically targets NDAs that were used to conceal information about child sexual abuse. This is a game changer, as it places the focus where it should be, on the protection of children and the need for transparency in cases of abuse. It's a recognition that justice should not be delayed or obstructed because of a legal contract. Children should never be silenced, and their stories should never be hidden in the name of protecting an image or a reputation. Trey's Law ensures that the voices of the most vulnerable are heard, and that those who commit abuse are held accountable. The law also highlights the importance of lawmakers and advocacy groups working together to create positive change. Trey's Law didn't just come about overnight. It was the result of years of hard work, advocacy, and a determination to protect children from the abuse and exploitation they have faced for far too long. It took the efforts of passionate individuals who were willing to fight for what was right, even when it meant standing up against powerful forces. This victory serves as a reminder that the law can be a powerful tool for justice and change when it is used to protect those who need it most. For Rebecca and JW, the passing of Trey's Law was a moment of hope, a chance to take back control of their narrative and finally stand up for what was right. But it also represented a bigger fight. Their courage to speak out wasn't just about their own story. It was about giving a voice to all those who have been silenced by NDAs in cases of abuse. It was about shining a light on a system that has failed so many, and working to ensure that the same mistakes are not repeated in the future. As more victims come forward and more stories are shared, Trey's Law is becoming a beacon of hope for those who have been kept in the dark for far too long. It's helping to rewrite the narrative of silence and shame that often surrounds cases of child abuse. It's creating a future where the truth can no longer be hidden behind legal agreements, and where justice is the priority. Trey's Law is a powerful reminder that when people come together to fight for what is right, real change can happen, and those who have been wronged can finally find the justice they deserve. Rebecca Lamb had always lived a life that seemed outwardly perfect to the public. As the daughter of Marcus and Joni Lamb, the founders of Daystar television network, she was no stranger to the spotlight. Growing up surrounded by faith and the influence of a media empire, it seemed as though everything she touched would turn to gold. However, behind the camera's flashing lights and the smiling faces, Rebecca was carrying a heavy burden, one that no one outside her immediate circle was privy to. The turmoil began when Rebecca's young niece, baby Lamb, was allegedly subjected to horrifying sexual abuse by a family member, someone who was trusted by the Lamb family and closely associated with Daystar. As the events began to unfold, it became clear to Rebecca that something was deeply wrong. Her gut told her that the family needed to stand up and do something about it. But that's when things became murky. Rebecca knew that speaking out about what she had witnessed would not be easy. Her family had a reputation to protect, and the Lambs were highly influential figures in the Christian television world. At the time, the world didn't know what was going on behind closed doors, and the pressure to keep quiet was immense. Rebecca and her husband, J.W., both felt the weight of this responsibility. However, what started as a family matter quickly spiraled into a much larger issue, one that involved not only Rebecca's family, but the future of Daystar itself. The family member involved in the alleged abuse, referred to as Pete, was close to the Lamb family. It was this closeness that made the situation even more complicated. Pete was trusted by Marcus and Joni Lamb, which only deepened the confusion and heartbreak Rebecca felt. It wasn't just a matter of her niece being abused by a stranger. It was a violation committed by someone within the very family they had worked so hard to build. As the details began to surface, Rebecca was torn between loyalty to her family and the undeniable truth that something terrible had occurred. Rebecca's emotional struggle was compounded by the pressure to keep silent. At the time, Rebecca and J.W. were reportedly pressured by Marcus and Joni to sign a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, which barred them from discussing any of the abuse allegations publicly. This NDA was not just a standard confidentiality agreement, but was used to keep them from speaking about the disturbing events that were unfolding within their own family. It felt like a betrayal of the very people they had trusted, and it left Rebecca feeling trapped. The weight of the situation was overwhelming, and she began to experience a deep sense of isolation. The NDA, while legally binding, was more than just a piece of paper. It was a reminder that silence was expected, no matter the personal toll it was taking. For Rebecca, it was a battle between her faith, her loyalty to her family, and her moral compass. She had always been taught that family was everything, and the Lamb family was no exception. However, as time went on and the truth started to eat away at her, Rebecca began to question whether silence was truly the right answer. How could she remain quiet when the truth of what had happened to baby Lamb was so undeniably painful? Despite the emotional strain, Rebecca didn't stop praying for baby Lamb and for justice. She had moments of clarity in which she knew that the right thing to do was to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. But the fear of what speaking out might do to her family and her own life kept her from taking that step. It wasn't just about the potential legal consequences. It was also about the impact that the truth would have on Daystar's reputation. For Rebecca, this became an excruciating internal conflict. Meanwhile, her husband J.W., who had witnessed some of Pete's disturbing behavior, wrote a letter to Jonathan Lamb, Rebecca's brother, expressing his concerns. In the letter, J.W. described troubling incidents he had witnessed, including inappropriate behavior from Pete toward baby Lamb. J.W. could not ignore what he had seen, and his letter was his attempt to make sure that anyone, would take the matter seriously. But despite the growing evidence of abuse, the Lamb family appeared to brush the concerns under the rug. The situation continued to be handled in a way that left Rebecca and J.W. feeling powerless and betrayed. What made matters even more difficult for Rebecca was the emotional toll it was taking on her. She had always been the one who held the family together, the one who kept the peace, and the one who, despite everything, believed in the power of forgiveness and redemption. However, as the allegations against Pete mounted, Rebecca found herself questioning everything she had believed in. She had trusted her family, trusted her faith, but now those foundations were being rocked by a betrayal she couldn't ignore. The silence that was being demanded of her was causing a deep emotional rift between Rebecca and those closest to her. As the situation unfolded, Rebecca began to notice strange shifts within the family dynamic. Her sister Rachel, who was also involved in the situation, allegedly warned Rebecca that speaking out could cost her family their home. This threat hung heavily over Rebecca and J.W., further amplifying the pressure to stay silent. The stakes were incredibly high, and the consequences of revealing the truth seemed insurmountable. What would happen to their family's ministry? What would happen to Daystar? But despite all of this, Rebecca felt that the truth needed to be exposed. She felt that baby Lamb's voice needed to be heard, no matter the consequences. However, the idea of doing so publicly seemed like an impossible decision. The world might have looked at Rebecca and her family as pillars of faith, but behind the scenes, she knew the truth, and it was far darker than anyone could imagine. The NDA, the pressure, and the overwhelming silence weighed heavily on Rebecca. She continued to struggle with the decision to speak out, knowing that doing so would change everything. The Lamb family's future, the future of Daystar, and even her own future were all tied to the secrets that had been buried for so long. But how could she live with herself if she didn't do something? The growing tension in Rebecca's life was further compounded by the realization that she couldn't keep quiet forever. Her faith told her to do the right thing, to protect the innocent, and to stand up for justice. But the fear of breaking her family apart, of destroying everything they had built, was something that made it almost impossible for her to make that first move. Rebecca's internal battle raged on as the silence continued. She was stuck in a place where she had to weigh her loyalty to her family against her moral duty to speak out. Would she betray her family by exposing the truth? Or would she stay silent and live with the consequences of allowing such a horrific crime to go unaddressed? These were the questions that haunted Rebecca as she tried to navigate her way through the mess of secrets, lies, and unspoken truths. Rebeccalamb had always been known for her strong faith and her dedication to her family. As the daughter of Marcus and Jonilamb, the founders of Daystar television network, she was no stranger to the public eye. But behind the scenes, Rebecca carried a weight that no one outside her immediate circle truly understood. For years, she had kept a painful secret, one that involved her niece, Baby Lamb, and a disturbing series of events that no one could have anticipated. It all started when Rebecca began to notice troubling behavior from a family member, Pete, who was closely associated with the Lamb family and worked at Daystar. Pete's actions were concerning, and Rebecca could no longer ignore the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Over time, her suspicions grew stronger as she began to witness incidents that made her feel uneasy. Pete, who had always been trusted by the family, seemed to have crossed boundaries that should never have been crossed, especially when it came to Baby Lamb. At first, Rebecca didn't know what to do. She had always been taught to protect her family and to maintain peace, but the situation became too serious to ignore. She confided in her husband, JW, who shared her growing concerns. Together, they began to understand the gravity of the situation, but they also knew that speaking out about it could bring devastating consequences. The family, especially Marcus and Joni, was deeply invested in maintaining the reputation of Daystar, and Rebecca knew that revealing the truth could shatter the image they had spent years building. The couple's internal struggle became even more complicated when they were reportedly pressured into signing a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, by Marcus and Joni. This NDA, as described by sources close to the situation, went far beyond the usual confidentiality agreements. It effectively silenced Rebecca and JW, forbidding them from discussing anything related to Baby Lamb's abuse or the events surrounding it. The NDA didn't just protect business interests. It was a tool to keep the family's reputation intact and to prevent the truth from being exposed to the public. Rebecca felt trapped. She had always believed in the power of transparency, in the importance of truth and justice. But now, she was being asked to remain silent. The silence was deafening, and it weighed heavily on her conscience. But as time went on, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that she was betraying not only Baby Lamb, but also herself. She was living in a constant state of fear, knowing that the truth was being buried, knowing that the right thing to do was to speak out, yet feeling powerless to do so. The pressure from her family, especially her mother Joni, to stay quiet was intense. Joni had always been a strong and determined figure, and Rebecca had always looked up to her. But now, Rebecca felt conflicted. How could she stand by and watch her niece suffer in silence, all while being bound by a legal agreement that seemed to protect the wrong people? The tension continued to build within Rebecca as she struggled with her faith and her loyalty to her family. She had always been taught to trust in God's plan, to believe that everything would work out in the end. But now, as the situation grew darker, Rebecca began to question everything she had ever believed. Could she really continue to live with the knowledge of what was happening while being forced to keep quiet about it? The guilt consumed her, and the fear of what might happen if she broke the silence was overwhelming. It wasn't until a significant change in the law that Rebecca found the courage to speak out. In the state of Texas, a new piece of legislation, known as Trey's Law, was passed, which had a profound impact on cases involving child sexual abuse. The law specifically targeted the misuse of NDAs in situations where abuse was involved. Under this new law, Rebecca and JW were no longer bound by the NDA that had kept them silent for so long. The law gave them a legal avenue to finally share what they knew, to speak the truth about what had happened to baby lamb, without fear of legal repercussions. The passing of Trey's law was a game-changer. It felt like a beacon of hope for Rebecca and JW, a glimmer of light in a situation that had felt hopeless for so long. For the first time, they were free to speak out, to reveal the truth that had been hidden for years. The weight of the NDA had been lifted, and they no longer had to live in fear of being punished for telling the truth. Lamb was ready to cross the fence with him. Rebecca knew that speaking out would have consequences. It would hurt her family, it would shake the foundation of Daystar, and it would put their entire ministry in jeopardy. But she also knew that she could no longer keep quiet. The truth needed to be heard. She couldn't live with herself if she continued to stay silent about what had happened to baby lamb. The pain that she had carried for so long now had a way out, and Rebecca was ready to take that step. Rebecca's revelation about the abuse involving baby lamb was not an easy decision. It was a painful, heart-wrenching decision that would change the course of her life and the lives of those around her, but it was a necessary one. By speaking out, Rebecca hoped to not only expose the truth, but also to bring justice to baby lamb, who had suffered in silence for far too long.